Here we go. And we are live.
We are live. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Ann. And this is Lifestyle Business on Launchpad TV.
Yeah.
Today, we're excited to welcome the president and founder of Public Democracy, Eric Sapp. Whether he's successfully enrolling a fully representative sample of Black Americans and other marginalized community into COVID-19 trials, creating data systems and processes to create more transparency and trust in the political information that's put on the web, or leading recruitment for the case against Monsanto over Roundup's role in causing cancer. Eric and his team are using big data to deliver more equity and unique solutions on behalf of communities that are vulnerable or left out. So he's going to be up in a moment. But first, do you guys like our new studio?
Yeah, welcome to Canada.
We are in Canada. That's right. We made it. We fled north of the border. We are currently in our mandatory 14-day quarantine to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus here in Canada. And we know that line well, don't we?
Well, we do. And I guess they're particularly worried about Americans spreading COVID-19. Fortunately, we took the flight. We're healthy. We're
not spreading. Shape. We're in quarantine.
Yeah.
Legit. It is a legit quarantine here in Canada.
You're not allowed to go for a walk.
Nope. You can't go in the boat.
No visitors.
No visitors.
Yeah.
And it's not like they give you a little thing and they're like, here you go, quarantine for 2 weeks. No, they're like into it. We get a call. We get 3 calls a day because each of us, even though we're under the same record, gets our own call, including Harper. So I had the woman, the guy yesterday was like, could I speak with Harper Schultz? Doesn't roll off the tongue here in French Canada. I was like, well, she doesn't have much to say.
I think we should let her speak for herself.
But it's pretty serious. You were making fun of me that it was bringing out my inner Canadian.
Well, it's sort of integrity based, right? That they call you and you have to answer, and I'm sure they're following a script, but it's got a little bit of your Canadian guilt going.
It does. I mean, I'm not even doing anything wrong. I'm literally following all of the guidelines to the quarantine. And yet I feel somehow like I am not doing it right. And so they call you and they're like, are you willing to answer these questions honestly and truthfully? And you're like, yes, I am. I am willing to answer these questions honestly and truthfully. And then they ask you all the questions and then you answer them honestly. And you're like, I still think there's going to be like Canadian ice. Which
do you think they're
amazing.
Watching right now?
They could be watching right now. And like, do you think they're tracing the calls?
Is broadcasting from Canada legal?
I think it is.
Okay.
It actually was dictated as one of the things you could do while in quarantine.
Oh.
You can work out in a home gym or with your own using an app. You can contact your friends and family via video or FaceTime or any other technology. And you can play games. You can do a lot of things. They had a whole list of things we can do while we're in quarantine. And we're trying to hit them all.
Sounds very constructive.
It was very constructive. Well, it wasn't that constructive, actually, because I think the 2-week quarantine is kind of, it's a little bit much.
Well, it doesn't incorporate testing, which is what we would like to incorporate. Although we're not seeing much of that in the U.S. either right now.
No, that's true. But we were thinking about it because it's so strict that it actually sets up pretty well for people to break the rules. I mean, not Canadians because we don't break the rules, but, it is somewhat of the honor system, even though they call and check in on you to make sure you're complying. But most Canadians will feel guilty if they're not.
Yeah.
But imagine if they had combined that with something that was like more attainable so that people actually stayed in quarantine, did all those things. But then there was a net positive for the Canadian government.
Like what?
Like you could say the Canadian government could come up with a test, I don't know, and make you pay the Canadian government to take the test. So you could say, okay, the minimum quarantine time, the minimum time to take the test is 5 to 7 days or whatever that data-driven scientific
unless
analysis.
You've been to the White House, in which case,
unless you've been to the White House, full 14 days. But, and then they could say you need to pay for the test. So then Canada would generate revenue from said test. It would be very consistent. And then they would also collect data. We're talking about data today, but they would have actual data. Instead, we have a self-reporting tool here where you say whether or not you have symptoms. If the tool actually doesn't work, which is also another situation. So I don't know why I would think that somehow there was going to be black ops or red ops showing up in my backyard if they
Canadian
can't get the
Mounties,
app.
right? They were
They full hat. It would be a full hat. It would be amazing. All right. Anyway, nonetheless, I'm just saying sometimes policies that are very strict don't actually get you the outcome that you're looking for.
Right.
And had they combined that with, say, a more moderate quarantine plus a testing capability, they could have created new revenue streams. They could have had more data. They could have had more insight. They could have been able to track it. Anyway, I think
what would you call that if they did?
I would call that productive policy making.
Good.
Which is my new term. I think we should be focused on productive policy making. We've been thinking about that a lot with the opportunity zone activities that we're going to be involved with EIG around supporting small businesses. And we were like, well, you know what? We're not probably going to change the tax bill to help people who care about capital gains want to invest in underrepresented companies and founders, because they just aren't going to do that. But what are things that we could actually build in that encourage the right behavior and activity?
Right.
What are some productive policies we could create?
That's a good question.
That's
I think
really
that's putting it out there. We discussed it with Eric too.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
TBD. But before we let Eric join us, let's jump into a little bit of member magic.
Let's hear what our members have been up to around the country
and in your
and celebrate some of their successes. You want me to go first?
You go first.
All right. Stockton in Stockton, our Launchpad member Seed, Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, and their founder Sukil Samra were mentioned in Bloomberg recently. Suki and her team were leading the way across the country's first mayor-led guaranteed basic income program.
We love that program. It's such a cool one.
By the way, Scott Santon's sidebar reached out. He said that one of the connects we made from our show with him has led to a basic income pilot in New Orleans.
What?
Yeah. So here we are on Launchpad TV making connections. So Seed is currently studying a control group of the residents participating in the exciting basic income program over in Stockton, which is continuing.
Let's head on back to the other side of the country to Newark. And Lily Doxey, founder of the Sponsorship Concierge and Black Girls Market, was a guest instructor for the Creative Collective, New York City's Creative Curriculum Virtual Series. There are a lot of C's in that. Her course, How to Create a Perfect Sponsorship Deck, was included in the Money Talk track and provided tips and insight about building the ideal portfolio for your business in order to pitch and obtain scholarships. Lily Doxey is a professional marketer and sponsorship guru who specializes in helping small businesses, entrepreneurs, and influencers seek sponsorship opportunities. And she also helps us out with our social media here at Launchpad. And if you are in Launchpad Newark, go find Lily and tap into some of that knowledge.
And be featured on Launchpad TV or on our Instagram accounts.
I agree. And congratulations are in store for Yendor. They were one of 39 nonprofit arts agencies who received the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation COVID-19 Rapid Response Grant.
Amazing.
That is amazing. Yendor was selected as an arts agency whose works build community engagement for people experiencing isolation, which we talked about with our guests last week.
Yep.
And the grants totaling $47,000 range from $250 to $2,000 to support interactive programming and the development of public art. The funding's use is unrestricted, thank God, and responds to an increased demand for services and or decreased funding resulting from the coronavirus.
And Yendor is going to be helping us with a new mural within Launchpad Newark. So
that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
All right, you wanna hit us up with the last one?
And Ashley Edwards is back again.
More wins for Ashley Edwards.
Mindright, she is crushing it. Last week, the American Heart Association announced that they will fund Mindright Health as part of the recently announced Bernard J. Tyson Impact Fund, which aims to honor the legacy of Mr. Tyson, the late chairman and chief executive officer of Kaiser Permanente, and longstanding member of the association's national board. The goal.
He's a high performer.
That's amazing.
Straight up.
Congrats to Ashley Edwards. And let's get on with the show.
Let's get on with the show.
You didn't think those were too long. I said, let's snip those down a little bit. But here we are.
Live and learn, guys.
Yeah.
Live and learn. All right. And now he is an entrepreneur, faith leader, and a political advisor who has spent his career supporting communities around the world to use big data to find unique solutions on behalf of groups that are vulnerable or left out. As the founder and president of Public Democracy, Eric and his team are pioneering the Data for Good movement, working with partners to bring responsible and ethical use of data to public policy and the private marketplace. Amazing. Welcome, Eric.
And it is a pleasure to be on with you all today, and appreciated hearing all those stories of other good things happening around the country with the intro.
It's great, isn't it? So exciting for us to be able to show our member stories, but also to get to chat with you. Where are you right now? You're in New Orleans, is that correct?
I am. No, I'm in Northern Virginia. Actually downstairs in my house, sheltering in place as most of us out here. And our big news as a family. I've got a new puppy just outside. So if there's a yip at some point, that's our big new addition to the COVID family in the Sapp household.
Well, that's exciting. And I think that's just now to be expected. We're all okay with, our daughter is down for a nap. Thankfully, we might hear her through the show. That would be not enough time.
That would not be ideal. We'd much prefer to hear the puppy.
Yeah.
But in fact, the woman who called me on my quarantine confirmation call yesterday, she had a dog barking in the background. I was like, it's hard to be official with your puppy.
Yeah.
Yeah, COVID is helping, I think, to break down some of help everybody see each other as the real people we are, and bring more of who we are into the workplace, and vice versa.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's get started. Let's start with Data for Good. You have talked a lot about what data is, what it represents, what that means, and values data, and how does your approach sort of differ from others in this very data-driven industry that we live in?
Well, I think just starting at the various highest big picture side of what Data for Good is, it's how we think about this asset, this reflection of who we all are, that it exists in our data, and mostly kind of who it serves and to what purpose. And Data for Good is saying, how do we think about this in a way that data should serve the people? It needs to be valuable, it needs to work within our economy, but its primary purpose should be serving those who create it. And one of the things that we do, and even just thinking about data differently, is behavioral data is at its core one of the greatest crowdsourcing exercises we've ever embarked on as a species. And you often hear companies and analytic firms, like ours, say, look what we found in the data. And we always try to be intentional in thinking, like, we didn't find or discover anything. All we ever do is follow the path that people have already discovered. And when you think about data in those terms, think about people not as users or customer base, but as co-creators in this process. It gives you both a different understanding of where the value share should be, but also different ways of utilizing the data. And that's how we've had a lot of the breakthroughs that you touched on some of them earlier, but is understanding this, not what can we take from the data, but what do people need? What are they showing us? And how can we serve that goal? And a final key point that I think is often missed in big data is we always start with the question of what's missing in the data, and why, like, I never describe us as a data analytics firm, and starting with, a lot of people say, what does the data show us? And data is always incomplete. And one of the most important things as it becomes a more powerful tool is understanding where those holes are. That's always where we start our process. And again, on the questions of equity and the like, a key component.
Interesting. And the idea, the sort of the concept of being co-creators in our data, we actually just watched a couple weeks ago, The Social Dilemma, the Netflix movie that talks about all the data that the social networks have on us and advertisers. Andrew Yang has just introduced, a idea of the data dividend. This has sort of been a concept that's been out there. How, as we move forward, I think there's an increasing recognition of how valuable our data that we produce and create is. So how, from a regulatory standpoint, or even a, income standpoint, is there any way for us to, monetize our data, or better own our data, or at least understand, how valuable what we're putting out in the ether on the internet is in what we're creating?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good question, and you hit on the key point, is understanding the value. And I think one of the mistakes we've had in data up to this point on the policy side is everything's been approached through a question of privacy. And like, we would never talk about wages in terms of privacy. We wouldn't talk about patents in terms of privacy. And I think we need to start thinking of data more in terms of its value and its value as an asset. And where it is unique and just incredible is it is one of, if not the only, assets in our economy that's value is based on an abundance model rather than a scarcity model. And that's vitally important to understand. I mean, it gets into economic theory, but everything we value pretty much economically is valuable because there's not enough of it. And yet that leads to hoarding, like
Right.
Supply and demand. I have something other people want. That makes it valuable to them. The more that I have that they want, the more valuable it is, et cetera. Data is different in that data's value, the other thing about scarcity is you don't want to use it. Your value comes from accrual, not usage as much. Data, the more you use it, the more valuable it gets. And the more you combine it, the more valuable it gets. And that creates, again, towards this data for good concept. It's actually an economic model that pushes towards the values and principles and kind of morals that many of us would aspire to. But it's based on kind of cold, hard economic theory. But to your question on, and what Andrew Yang was doing, it's how we actually got into this space on that same concept of value share, is my data, your data, any of our data in Facebook by itself isn't worth that much. And saying, oh, I want my share, you're not going to get that much because your individual data isn't as valuable. It's when your data is combined with everyone else's and the derivatives that come off of that the value accrues. And that's where we're at this point that we need to look to policy solutions. We need to look at societal solutions, because what's happened is monopolies have taken all of our data. They have accrued that value. They are taking the monetary value and they're also applying it to decide how it's used and what we all see and experience in the world because of it, none of which serves us. There is a much better way of using this asset we're creating that better shares that value and makes it work for the people.
And obviously, the easy one to pick on is it's always Facebook, right? Because they capture data and then they are very deliberate about monetizing that, and they essentially own it. And in reality, that is so very visible and easy to understand. But are there other examples of organizations that house our data that we'd be surprised by?
Be surprised by it. You should not be surprised in this day and age to know that other people are housing your data. If you are getting something for free, in any digital means, it is for that reason. I mean, your GPS, your weather, all those things are collecting data. It is generally anonymized and aggregated, but it is, again, these companies exist because we are doing the work. Now, the work, again, that factory model is a decent one. Like, the company has to exist. It has to create the structure. This isn't just a simply, oh, I own all of that, I want it all back. They add value, but they add value to work we are creating. I will say Facebook makes itself an easy example on these things, sadly, because they don't do even basic things to protect or serve their communities. They have turned it into such a unidirectional model. And part of the reason for that, which goes back to the theories we're discussing, is how the Facebook is selling attention. Its economic model is selling attention. it doesn't have to have that economic model. It has chosen that one and has maintained it, as others have shifted. Even Google, which has some of that, is trying to meet the needs of the user more in search and the like. Facebook's trying to sell attention and eyeballs. And it's all the AI that's learning off the data is built on an algorithm that literally is not as its foundation. And as all of us as users, understanding those underlying purposes is a key to understand both who has our data, how it's being used, and what the outcomes are going to be.
Yeah.
So where do you think this all, from a data, I think there's becoming more of awareness around how much access to our data, let's use Facebook as the continuing example, has. We've seen the CEOs of some of the social media companies, including Facebook, be called before Congress to testify a couple times over the last couple of years. There's not much of a regulatory environment around these companies currently. What are the pressures? What are the things that need to happen, or you would project to happen that sort of restore some balance in the value of our data, consumer protections? I'm sort of going to draw an analogy to your work with Roundup and Monsanto. This is sort of that level of an issue that people don't really understand how their data that they're creating is being used. Is that going to come from the federal government? Is it going to come from more individual awareness and people deciding to get off Facebook or deciding not to use these platforms? Is it a combination thereof? Where do you think this all plays out?
Well, it's a good question. It's a complicated one, and I mean the answer is it's not going to be any one thing. It's going to be a combination. We're a public benefit corporation, missionally driven company, but we're a business, and our mission is to align what's right with what works. And we have that mission for a reason, but I think that's what applies here. We need economic models. Regulation is going to be really hard to keep up with this. I don't see that as the solution. It is a part, but you just can't stay in front of these evolutions. We need to create incentives, better incentives for our economic systems to work towards these better outcomes. And I think we do that. You all mentioned opportunity zones earlier and the work Launchpad's doing in those. We did work with the US Census in opportunity zones. And this is where the markets can align with this better data of when we went into these zones, I could find the only good data we could find on these communities. I could find great data on predatory lending. I could find out who wanted a payday loan when. And if I was to look at what defined these communities in the broad commercial data, it was that they're payday lending targets. That's who they were to the community, because that was all the value that had been seen and invested in building data around them. And this is probably the most important point on data, and why I keep going back to the holes. The data that's created is what informs things. It's what informs our machine learning. It's what informs our investment strategies. And people invest on the data that exists. When there is no data, that's where these inequalities come from. And what we did was started just building the data on these communities that found, and we could take a whole show going into all the specific pieces that we uncovered, but found these incredible economic models for banks to come in and set up better banking systems, because there was an incredible opportunity for them that even the local big banks in the States didn't know about, for businesses to invest, for even your work in the group work and the spaces of how there was this need, especially for single moms, to have kind of workspace that they could come into in these communities, because they were looking to start things up, but that there just wasn't the data created in a package manageable way to inform that type of decision making. It was there in aggregate. The people were making it, just no one had bothered to collect it. And when we collected it and collected it with the census, we changed in Birmingham, Alabama, dramatic changes in how they were structuring their opportunity zones and investment decisions made by big investors that suddenly were working to support what these communities needed, instead of coming in from the outside and saying, oh, well, we think we could, again, do a real estate flip. Now they saw this great opportunity because of local demand, and they were matching markets, which ultimately is what this should all be about.
And so when you do talk about holes a lot, and the sort of the damage and the issues that can come from that, but and opportunity zones is a perfect example, because I've often sat at tables where the folks around that are trying to solve the problem are like, well, we need the data elements or the demographics or all this information that's like very easy to pull up on a lot of things, but doesn't actually tell the story. I was like, I don't know where you're thinking this magic data is going to come from, but like, it's not going to be a turnkey situation where you pump in a report and all of a sudden you know exactly what the right answer is in a zone. You have to actually gather that information in different ways. How do you see solving some of these holes in the data, and how are you guys going about doing that?
Well, so some of this is where some of the regulatory side, government could continue to require that it be included. Like, this has been a big factor in health data, that simply people collect, but they won't report some of the racial data and other pieces that are vital to getting these better insights. And they matter for those communities and those marginalized communities. But I mean, COVID has made incredibly clear, we're all connected in this stuff. And something that benefits, I'm trained as a pastor, so there's a moral calling to care for our neighbor and be our brother's keeper. But in a COVID world, that makes sense for me as well, and understanding why African American communities are getting infected at such a higher rate, and how that's because of the jobs that they're working and taking the steps to help prevent and slow that spread. Well, those are the people, they're in that situation because they're delivering our groceries. I get to work from home, and we are all connected in these pieces that it benefits the larger society, it benefits the specific groups, reduces costs, and that's where kind of all of these elements start to fit together. And then on the science side as well, when you fill these holes, you get better, more complete data information, whether it's public health, whether it's market analysis, whether it's social good, that is more valuable. And so there are lots of ways to align that. Sometimes it can take foundational investment to build up the core data sets that then all of a sudden the businesses are able to be like, holy cow, I can make a ton of money serving that need. Now I'm going to start advertising in it, and boom, it's taken off, as now everyone can access that data that serves the people. It could be governments requiring reporting. It could be the local business or entrepreneur who sees the opportunity. I mean, we're talking about economic inefficiencies. That's where you can make a lot of money. And you do that money, though, serving the interests of the people. That's where data becomes good.
Yep, makes sense.
We were talking a little bit about sort of the public health aspect of this. And, I think it's a really good point that, it's never been more clear that, we are all intertwined as a society. But there are people who, race and ethnicity, as well as, your sort of economic, where you are in the workforce, plays into your vulnerability to this. One of the areas that we're sort of all challenged with right now is, around the politicization of the vaccine and of sort of the public health. You talk about sort of breaking down barriers created by systemic bias. Is there going to be work in clinical trials and ensuring that, when a vaccine comes out, that, people are really comfortable, and that, people in communities most impacted are safe, and that we can kind of communicate in that? And I guess this is a fingers crossed question here, that we're all going to be able to buy into this when we do get a vaccine.
I think there's two key pieces to that question, and one I'm going to put one a little on the side but I think we need to get back to it, which is on the disinformation and the computational propaganda piece. There is an intentional effort being made by foreign and domestic actors to spread lies and spread division. It's intentional and it's data driven. That's one piece, but more fundamental is your question of, again, inclusive data and good public health data. We completed the first ever large scale clinical trial around COVID that was fully representative of the population, and learned a ton of things in that process. And part of the reason was we are not a clinical recruiting firm, hadn't done a lot of that before. We had done the Monsanto case, had worked in some of these areas, but came in last minute in New Orleans, where Ochsner Health was trying to complete a large seroprevalence, get a sense of the entire spread throughout the community before New Orleans reopened. And because of our work with census, because of all the other work we did, when we came in and they said, can you recruit these people on very short notice? We were like, yeah. And we were looking at the communities and their behavior, and we know you want a sample, so we also will get you a representative sample with this. And there was kind of this like eye roll. That's cute. You all haven't done this before. No, you won't. No one ever does. And it's impossible. And they were like, we love it that we want to be as representative as possible, but no one ever gets representative samples, Tuskegee. And the number of times since I've been in this place that people just use Tuskegee as a, okay, check. Now we don't have to deal with it anymore. And it is real. Those issues are real. But what we learned was like, wait a second. Is Tuskegee the problem, or was it a problem? We accepted it was a problem. And again, with these holes in the data, so we've got a lot of data on how you recruit white 50-year-old men. That's how we set up our systems. We know what works, and yep, those people just never show up. And is it because they never show up, or because we're only recruiting white 50-year-old men? And our approach to data and the empathy-driven behavioral approaches we use are responsive to need and demand rather than I want you to do what we want. We look at what are the people telling us they need and want. And what we realized was, again, we didn't come up with some special way to get Black people and Hispanic people to do what we want and get tested. We found a way to get out of their way of claiming agency in their own health decisions and getting tested as they wanted. And so we were supplying the opportunities and the moments and the communications in different ways and giving them different pathways. And we gave them different opportunities and times than others. And again, it wasn't like, oh, this is going to be for the Black people and Hispanic people. We gave everybody the selection based on what they needed. And what we realized were some of these groups that are always left out needed different things. And a classic example, I think the best example, which also ported over to a lesson we learned in Opportunity Zones, was because of Opportunity Zone work, we saw single moms were always left out of there's no good data on single moms, again, unless it's like, here are the problems. And so we made a point, we said, we're going to also make sure single moms are included in this study. And what we learned about that by looking for them, where's the hole? We know there's a hole. Now let's pay attention. How do we fill that hole? Those single moms wouldn't respond. They couldn't sign up 2 and 3 weeks before the study. They couldn't sign up 2 and 3 days before the study. But the night before the test, 11:30 at night, and as they were reading about how to help my kid keep up while they're in daycare all day, or how to keep my family safe when I'm working a front-end job, in that moment, when they got the opportunity, you want to be tested tomorrow? You can pick your time and place. It's free. You'll find out in 2 days. They jumped at that opportunity. And they jumped in incredible numbers. And that is how you fill it. Again, we didn't do anything to get them to do it. We just met them in the moment when they were looking for it.
Right.
I mean, I think that's such an interesting and universal concept that people miss, right? We're rushing so fast to the answer and to complete the exercise or to complete the study that we don't think about what is the goal that we're trying to, right? It's about a better understanding of individuals. And I'm just off the data side for a second, which is, for entrepreneurs out there and people who are starting businesses and thinking about it, these same biases in data can also be biases in how you think about your customers and how you're meeting your customers and how you're meeting that moment, because your customer don't make assumptions. And I think that's why people will always say to me like, oh, well, what's your demographic that you're looking for? I'm like, well, it's actually community based. It depends on what city we're in, what efforts we want to achieve, what the goal is, all kinds of these other pieces. But it's not easy to really be thoughtful and creative about how you approach the problem. And I think this is a great example where, if you want to talk to single moms, it's not about, coming up with some giveaway. It's actually much more about finding the problem they're trying to solve and meeting them. I love that.
Yep.
It's a great lesson we can all learn.
Yeah, you raised a great point with entrepreneurs, because in one sense, in theory, we start with the right question. Like, everyone knows you need to understand your market. Like, that's a classic start. One of the first thing you do a business, let's do a market analysis. But then so quickly we switch from, now how do we get them to do what we want? Now we understand our market. Now I'm going to shift mental gears to here's what I'm selling, and this is what they need to know about it, instead of continuing that process through of how do I shape everything I'm doing to meet that. I mean, we could talk about it as people or whatever, or as markets, to meet that market need and truly to serve them. And in businesses, you see this. It's interesting when people think of brands, they're willing to go to this, how do I do a values aligned brand? How do I do a brand that people get excited about? But then it'll go up, we're going to run this ad. This is the most important thing in my product that everyone needs to know about. And it's like, no, like, just don't stop. You've been doing it the right way. Keep going. What is it that they really need? And how do I make sure they understand that about my product or my business? And the more you do that, it is a practice. It is a discipline. It's one that data makes easier if you're really paying attention. But also, as you do those things, you will build the better data that continues to feed in a virtuous loop. Again, what we've seen a lot in commercial data is a different approach, where it's how do I get them to pay attention? And again, even on a pure commercial side, buying is not the same as looking. And if all you're doing is selling product, understanding what people will commit to versus what they'll pay attention to is a really significant difference, that because of how we're collecting data, we're getting imperfect and impartial outcomes when we could get better ones for people and for the businesses and for the governments and for the nonprofits, all building off of it.
I mean, you're oftentimes you're in the business of influencing, right? And influencing either your clients or influencing government or what that is around these issues. Have you seen a change or a trend line that suggests people are actually listening more easily? Or is it easier to get people sort of bought into this sort of viewpoint, or do we still face major challenges?
I mean, anyone who turns on the news knows we face plenty of challenges right now. And, those of us south of your border, where you are at this point, are obviously facing. I mean, don't open Twitter and see those flashed in front of us all the time. But like,
well, we
what
get Canadian
we do,
Twitter up here.
Yeah, you all can still watch it. We just have to deal with the guy across the river who's spouting it all. What we do is like, and it is influence. Some of it's semantics, but the semantics matter. We work to empower rather than influence. Now, but what you empower is how you can influence. And like, empowering the better angels of our nature is ultimately what our entire business mission is. Now, you do those in ways that can align with the interests that you need. Like when you're trying to get really strong COVID outcomes. Well, what are those better angels that we're trying to empower when we're doing our civic engagement advocacy work, some political work? Like, it's that same piece. When you're, again, pick an opportunity zones. What are the better angels of our businesses, of our communities, of the government? It's in how is it in the interest of elected official, the CEO, and the community leader to all do the same things instead of yelling at each other and fighting each other? We want to build something together where we align all of those interests. And it can take work, but that's, to us, the most sustainable, powerful, and systemic shifting way to influence is by, and that's in Public Democracy, our name, it's by bringing people along in the process and helping them. My view on kind of human nature is people are all fundamentally selfish, and they all aspire to be better than they are. And they will want to talk about and drive towards that better ideal, and they will spend the extra time for the selfish one. And it's when we combine those two, align what's right with what works together, that you start to bring about real change. And that takes time, process, work, but it creates much more valuable outcomes when it does work.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's exactly where, that sort of sums up where we are as a nation right now. We're sort of at this crossroads of a big decision that people are already making, and we'll be making November 3rd. And it's really about the direction of where we're going as a country. If you can align, self-interest with public interest, which I think is possible, and create the incentives for, more, equitable and inclusive sort of growth. It feels like we've all been on this, fast food diet that we sort of know is unhealthy for us, has been, creating rising, inequities and, distrust of one another. And the work that you're doing is really about restoring that sense of sort of the public to, the public good to democracy.
Yeah. And I mean, just to go back to COVID, in that connection piece, what we're seeing now, trying to, sides playing out, it's not a rural America versus urban America, black, white, Democrat, Republican, all these divisions. And it's also what we see in the data. We have so much more that we have in common and that unites us.
Yeah.
And it's that service to the better outcomes for some that also work to all of our benefits in that inclusive data study that we did. And again, even if you heard the way I described it, what was special about it? It was the first to include, fully inclusive on African Americans and Hispanics. So it's very easy to think, well, that was for those people. And we had breakthroughs for those communities because they were included. It was one of the first studies we all remember the headlines that blacks are dying at a much higher rate of COVID. That's what New Orleans thought. And what that study showed, that has now been replicated many places around the country, is they weren't dying at a higher rate. They were getting infected at a much higher rate, dying at higher numbers to their population, but dying at about the same rate. And from a public health perspective, that's a big distinction, because what you do to solve for these people are much more likely to die if they get COVID versus there's a lot more of these people getting COVID are very different outcomes. And even from just a social perspective, it goes from, oh, that's a shame they're dying, but that's not my problem. Like we saw this with schools too, horrible studies that said Black and Hispanic kids are more likely to get COVID or have bad outcomes from the city. It's no, they weren't. They're more likely to have COVID, so there's more of them in the hospital. So both as white parents, your kids aren't safer than them because they're white. We're all connected. But then the other piece that came out of that study was it was one of the first, because we had a fully inclusive sample of all of the population. It was one of the first to identify asymptomatic spread as a key challenge. This was, again, back in May when everyone had symptoms because you'd only go and get tested if you had symptoms. By bringing everybody in, we identified most of the people who were infectious didn't have symptoms. That's obviously hugely important for how we respond, what we do, what our responsibilities are, and that affects all of us. And that's that both and that can work into this process when the data is done right.
Yep.
For sure. So just because you brought up COVID and politics, what I wanted to ask you about was The president recently, he didn't even have a COVID scare. He had COVID.
Yeah.
And some of the things that, as someone who early in the COVID crisis was very anxious about what my potential outcome would be should I were to get COVID, he made me feel really good about my outcomes because he sort of sent some misleading information, and some of his comments were probably poorly directed. So talk to us about, first of all, did your head explode when that happened? And then second, what does that actually mean for us in terms of having our leadership and the vaccine and being able to get people feeling confident and comfortable about that?
Yeah. Well, we've been failed in our leadership in response to this pandemic. That's clear just looking at America should be the best in the world, and we've been at the very bottom. And it's because we've had leaders that haven't tried to bring us together to beat this, but have tried to just get to the next news cycle and through the election. And and there are hundreds of thousands of families who've lost loved ones as a result of that. The cost, we've lost more Americans now than I think, Vietnam, Korea, the American Revolution, and multiple wars combined. The impact is very real. And I think it is broad enough, the economic impact, $8 trillion loss, like those things, Americans throughout our country are feeling that. With whatever it is, 45 plus or however many people are now infected from the White House that have just been reported. Sadly, even the president's son recently. People see that most Americans aren't dumb. They know what's happened. They've watched. I think a lot of people have hoped that we could get away with that different, or I'm just going to tough it out. Chris Christie's still in the hospital. Herman Cain was killed from a rally. The fact that Trump, with the best care in the entire world, still ended up on oxygen and is now, didn't die is good for him. It's good. You don't want people to die from this. He got exceptional care. Most people don't die from COVID, but the disruption to our country, to his life, to everyone around him from his lack of just being careful, not only for himself, but for his loved ones, has been witnessed and felt by our country. And you've seen in the response to this, I think, that a recognition of that these rallies where they encourage people to flout the best science, people still do it. And they always, because they want to make a stand. But more and more of those communities, people are getting sick as a result. And, it's not obviously going to change everybody's mind, but I am less concerned about, President Trump is going to keep tweeting that he's a Superman and that all this stuff works. And more you're hearing and seeing the rest of our government, our public health institutions, the businesses that stand to make billions and trillions of dollars off of selling these things, come forward and say, no, we have to do this right. And we're not going to rush this for a political outcome. And to what the solutions are and how we rebuild the trust that's been eroded, it goes back to what we've been discussing. Like, we need to make sure the trials have full inclusion as they're tested. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that testing picks up, and we need to be intentional and aware and confront the very direct, algorithmically targeted efforts to undermine trust from, external actors like Russia, internal, alt-right, white supremacist groups that are feeding the attention generating algorithms to drive disinformation against even a lot of the targeting right now is against the flu vaccine, as these are strategic decisions being made by our enemies. of driving down trust in the flu vaccine, because if people don't trust the flu vaccine, they won't trust the COVID vaccine. And you've got, a month ago or so, 25% of RT.com, the Russian propaganda news site, 25% of its American audience was engaging in Spanish, its content in Spanish. Like, they are creating content on COVID in Spanish specifically to target and mislead Spanish-speaking Americans. The African Americans in May, and we're saying over 90% were planning to get the flu vaccine this fall. A month or so ago, it was down to 35%. That's because of this direct targeting and intentional effort. And like, those communities need to speak up. Their leaders need to understand this and work to counter it. We all need to work together to counter it. For those communities, for ourselves, like, those are some of the easiest ones to illustrate. But this is being pushed to all of us. And this idea of the fight and just Trump's tweets, when we spend all our time focused on that, we miss out on all the stories of people helping their neighbors, of the successes that are being made, of the simple steps we can take in our daily lives to combat this disease, return things to normal. And, those are each of us can have our power on what we choose to engage and to consume. Watch, if you make those intentional choices, how many additional ones you will be given in that better direction versus, I wonder what Trump did today again. What's that latest tweet? You'll keep getting more and more of those. Right. And those are things we can all do. But then again, there are regulations that can be made on that. You saw with some of the stories over the last week that were like fake emails and Russian generated leaks, immediate crackdowns, because there'd been so much pressure on Facebook and Twitter to stop them as soon as they were published, to say, we know this is disinformation. We're not just going to stand back and wait until there's 2 billion shares before we put a notice up. Those steps across the board are going to be necessary, because we are being changed and attacked as a people. And then those attacks are feeding a system that then creates inertia that makes things even worse. And we can choose to be better. And again, it all goes back to building better data about who we actually are and what we actually want. And last point, just in like the political work, we're seeing Americans don't want to be angry at each other. It's tiring. Like, I mean, there's a few, and it's a decent way to raise small dollar donors. But it's not what people want, and giving them that positive message, giving them that thing they can believe in again, this reason why their neighbor why that person even that's on the other side of the aisle isn't such an evil person, but we can agree on these things. They flock to that content. You need to create it and promote it in the same way. And as you do, we see then the algorithms start to shift to show more and more of it. But when everybody is looking at data that says, well, I can raise money by attacking that side or this liberal or that conservative again, and that's all we're creating, then we just create more and more of that data. And those are the decisions and the choices that each of us make, that our institutions make, and that will shape where we head in the future.
That's amazing.
Interesting. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. It was fascinating to sort of have your insight, the use of our data, the sort of the common good that you're aspiring towards for, the work that you're doing and our country. And, we'll see how this plays out in just, 3 short weeks, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. But, we're grateful for all of the work that you're doing here.
Well, thank you. And I'll just close, especially since we finished with the disinformation side, with just all the data and things we see. I am hopeful, and even dealing in some of those darker places, the people, the data creators are pushing in a different direction. There's more value in that direction, and increasingly we're seeing that recognized. So despite all you can see on Twitter, personally with all of our work, I leave hopeful for our future, for the world my children will grow up in. But it's one that we all have a responsibility and a role in shaping. So thanks for you all playing the part, even in having these conversations and everything you do to empower people through Launchpad.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
and thank you for your work.
Yeah.
All right, we'll say
All
goodbye
right,
to
we'll say
Eric,
goodbye,
and
and
we look forward to seeing you next week. We've got Mike Morey, a partner at SKDK in New York City, and a 20-year veteran in the field of communications, politics, and campaign management. So with less than 3 weeks away from the election, this should be very interesting.
yeah. Well, that was interesting having Eric on today. I thought, a takeaway, you always feel like these things are so overwhelming, and we watched that movie Social Dilemma, and you understand that there's these algorithms on the other side of it. But what one of the things that I heard was, what we choose to engage with helps feed the algorithm, and is creating our own data trail and the data about ourselves. So I know that you and I have both tried to do that, and frankly be off Facebook a little more. But when we are engaging in a positive way, not engaging in a way that makes us angry or
Except if you disagree that climate change is a real thing.
Well, we're putting out positive data around that.
I'm just teasing.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us today here on Lifestyle Business, and we'll be back again next Thursday. See
From
you then.
Canada.
So long, folks.